Tonight, you're royalty, surrounded by gold, rumors, and relatives who smile as they sharpen their knives. Forget fairy tales. In the palace, breakfast comes with poison, and sleep comes with witnesses. Still think that crown is worth it? Let's see how long you'd last. Before we begin our story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because by the end of this video, you will be fast asleep, and share in the comments what other topics interest you, and we will make videos especially for you. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable. We're starting the journey. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning with 40 people staring at you. Not just in your room, actually surrounding your bed. Watching you yawn, watching you stretch, waiting to see what you do next. Sounds like a nightmare, right? For kings and queens in Europe between the 14th and 18th centuries, this was every single morning of their lives. Outside the royal bedroom, nobles stand in cold stone hallways. Some arrived at 4 in the morning. Why so early? Because being close to the king means power. Being first through that door means getting noticed. And getting noticed by a monarch can change your family's fortune forever. So they wait, shivering in their fancy clothes, hoping today is the day they catch the royal eye. The competition is fierce. One duke elbows another for a better position. Everyone knows their exact rank. Standing in the wrong spot can cause a scandal that lasts for weeks. Finally, the bedroom doors swing open. The show begins. This ceremony has a fancy French name, the lever. It means rising or getting up, but it represents far more than simply leaving bed. This is political theater. This is a power display. This is how you remind several dozen ambitious nobles exactly who is in charge. And the answer is, the person still lying in that enormous bed under silk covers worth more than a village. The first gentleman of the bedchamber walks in. His job, wake up the king or queen. That's it. That's his entire responsibility for this moment. Yet families fight for generations to get this position. Why? Because touching the monarch, even just to shake their shoulder gently, means you are trusted. You are important. You are close to unlimited power. The first gentleman earned this job through his family's loyalty, through political connections, and probably through some very expensive gifts to other courtiers. Behind him comes a whole parade of people. Each person has one specific task. One noble carries the mourning robe, just the robe, nothing else. Another brings stockings. A third holds the shirt. Imagine having a different person for each piece of clothing. There's actually clever strategy here. By dividing these tiny tasks among many nobles, the monarch keeps them all competing. Everyone wants a bigger role. Everyone wants to be more important. So they fight each other instead of challenging the throne. Meanwhile, actual power stays concentrated in one person. The order matters absolutely. Person number 7 cannot hand over the royal doublet before person number 6 presents the royal sash. Why not? Because tradition says so. Because breaking the order insults everyone who came before. Because court life runs on rules so complicated that people literally write books explaining them. Step out of line once, and you might find yourself exiled to your country estate, far from power and influence. Nobody wants that. The monarch sits up in bed. Dozens of eyes watch. Someone hands over the shirt. But not directly to the monarch. The shirt passes through 3 different pairs of noble hands before reaching the royal body. The duke outranks the count, so the count cannot directly clothe the monarch. Every gesture reveals who has power and who does not. Visitors from other countries watch this ceremony and take notes. They report back about who stands closest to the throne. They analyze who touches what. International politics sometimes depends on where someone stands during the morning dressing ritual. Let's talk about the clothes themselves for a moment. One royal outfit costs more than most people earn in 10 years of hard work. The silk comes from far away. The gold thread woven into the fabric is actual gold. The buttons are pearls. The buckles are silver inlaid with gems. This expense serves a purpose. When foreign ambassadors see the king dressed in clothes worth a fortune, They think twice about starting wars. They know they face a kingdom with resources to spare. The clothing sends a clear message about power and wealth. While the clothing ceremony continues, a barber arrives. His job is to trim the royal beard or style the royal hair. This sounds simple until you remember he holds a sharp razor near the throat of the most powerful person in the kingdom. One slip could be fatal. One tiny cut could be seen as assassination attempt. So the barber moves very carefully. His hands never shake. He probably does not sleep well the night before royal shaving days. But his family becomes wealthy from this position, so the stress might be worth it. Next comes the perfume. Court life in this era has a challenge. It smells unpleasant. People rarely bathe because they believe water spreads disease. Toilets are primitive. Hundreds of people crowd into palaces not designed for such crowds. The solution: strong perfume. The royal perfumer mixes special blends using ingredients from around the world. Whale secretions, musk from animals, exotic flowers, rare spices. The result smells powerful enough to be detected from 3 rooms away, which actually proves helpful. You can smell a monarch approaching, giving you time to prepare proper greetings. Now the jewelry appears. Boxes of treasures arrive, carried carefully by servants who know dropping one means instant dismissal. Rings slide onto royal fingers. Each ring tells a story. This one belonged to a great-great-grandfather. That one was a gift from a foreign queen. This giant ruby represents a peace treaty. That diamond came from a conquered territory. Necklaces drape across the royal neck, heavy with gold and gems. A single necklace might weigh several pounds. Wearing the crown jewels is literally exhausting. But the point is showing wealth and power to everyone watching. Finally, breakfast time arrives. Even eating follows complicated rules. Special servants called tasters sample every dish first. They take a bite of bread. They sip the wine. They taste the meat. Then everyone waits. 5 minutes pass, 10 minutes. If the taster stays healthy, the monarch can eat. This is not paranoid behavior. This is common sense. Poison is a genuine threat when you rule a kingdom. Plenty of monarchs die from eating the wrong meal, prepared by the wrong cook, bribed by the wrong enemy. So yes, cold breakfast is annoying, but it beats the alternative. The actual breakfast is substantial. Roasted meat for breakfast. Multiple kinds of bread, cheese, fruits preserved in honey, wine mixed with water. Enough food to feed 20 people, all for one monarch who probably cannot finish half of it. But excess is part of the message. While nobles stand around watching, unable to eat themselves, they see abundance and power on display. It's a daily reminder of royal wealth and authority. After eating comes the most important part of the morning, religious service. Monarchs claim they rule by divine right. God chose them to be king or queen. Obviously, they need to look religious, so every morning includes attending Mass in the royal chapel. The service lasts at least an hour. There is music, incense, prayers, and more prayers. The monarch kneels in a special area where everyone can see how devoted they are. This public display of faith reinforces a key idea. Royal power comes from God. Anyone questioning the monarchy is therefore questioning God. It's effective propaganda presented as morning prayer. During the service, the royal confessor holds enormous power. This priest hears the monarch's private confessions. He knows royal secrets. He advises on spiritual matters, which often means political matters too. Should we go to war? Asked the confessor. Should we marry our daughter to that foreign prince? The confessor has opinions. Some confessors become the real power behind the throne, whispering advice that shapes entire kingdoms. And they gain this influence simply by being trustworthy enough to hear a monarch's sins. Finally, after several hours, the morning routine ends. The monarch leaves their private chambers and enters the public areas of the palace. Real work begins: audiences, meetings, decisions about running a kingdom. But those first hours already accomplished something important. The lever ceremony reminded everyone of their place in the hierarchy. It displayed royal wealth to anyone watching. It protected the monarch through careful protocols. And it connected royal power to religious authority. What looked like a complicated ritual of getting dressed was actually sophisticated political control. Nothing at court happens by accident. Even putting on socks serves a purpose. In the world of European royalty, between 1400 and 1700, privacy did not exist, simplicity was impossible, and even waking up required an audience. Absolute power, it turns out, comes with a price, but at least the clothes are expensive. The royal treasury sits deep within the palace walls, behind doors 3 feet thick and guarded day and night. Inside, wooden chests line the stone walls from floor to ceiling. Each chest is bound with iron. Each lock requires a different key, and each key belongs to a different official who must be present to open it. Why such extreme security? Because these rooms contain wealth beyond imagination. Gold coins stacked in barrels, silver plates piled high, jewels loose in boxes like children's toys. The treasure of an entire kingdom concentrated in one heavily protected space. Royal wealth in Europe between 1400 and 1700 was not just about having money. It was about displaying power in a form everyone could see and understand. A king could claim to be mighty, but words alone convinced nobody. However, a king wearing a crown made from 5 pounds of gold and covered in rubies the size of walnuts, that sent a message. Wealth that could be seen, touched, and admired proved legitimacy more effectively than any speech or document. So monarchs collected treasure not merely to own it, but to show it off at every possible opportunity. Consider the crown jewels themselves. Every kingdom maintained a collection of regalia, used during coronations and important ceremonies. Crowns, scepters, orbs, ceremonial swords, golden spurs, rings, and more. These objects were not just expensive, they were sacred symbols of royal authority passed down through generations. Some pieces were hundreds of years old, worn by dozens of kings and queens before the current monarch. Touching them connected a ruler to all their ancestors. Wearing them declared divine right and unbroken succession. The jewels themselves held meaning. Rubies represented power and courage. Sapphires symbolized wisdom and divine favor. Emeralds meant fertility and prosperity. Every gem told part of the story of kingship. The actual value of these treasures was staggering. A single crown could cost as much as building an entire castle. One famous jewel from this era contained 3 enormous stones set in gold and pearls. It was considered the most valuable single piece of jewelry in all of Europe. Kings fought over it. Kingdoms negotiated for it. Owning it meant prestige that money alone could not buy. Weight finally disappeared from history, probably broken apart and sold during a war. People mourned it like losing a person. It represented not just wealth, but an entire age of royal power and artistic achievement. Royal clothing matched the jewelry in extravagance. Monarchs owned hundreds of outfits, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship. The fabric alone represented enormous expense. Silk had to be imported from distant, eastern lands along dangerous trade routes. One bolt of silk cost more than a farmer earned in a year, and a single royal gown might use 30 or 40 yards of silk. Velvet was even more expensive, because producing it required special techniques and huge amounts of labor. The deepest, richest colors like royal purple or crimson demanded rare dyes extracted from specific sea creatures or insects. Thousands of shells or bugs died to create enough dye for one robe. Then came the decoration. Gold thread was literally made from real gold, beaten so thin it could be woven into fabric. Embroiderers spent months stitching elaborate patterns onto royal garments. Flowers, animals, family emblems, religious symbols, geometric designs. Every inch of fabric might carry decoration. Some robes were so heavily embroidered with gold thread that they could barely bend. Wearing them was like wearing flexible metal. Queens complained privately that their formal gowns were almost too heavy to walk in. But complaining publicly was impossible. The weight and discomfort proved the outfit's value. If it was easy to wear, it was not expensive enough. Buttons and clasps presented another opportunity to display wealth. Why use simple fasteners when you could use pearls the size of grapes? Royal tailors attached precious stones to every possible surface. Diamonds held capes closed. Rubies decorated sleeves. Emeralds lined hems. Some outfits had so many jewels that they glittered with every movement, catching candlelight and creating a sparkling effect visible across large rooms. Foreign ambassadors reported being nearly blinded by the light reflecting off a monarch during formal audiences. That was exactly the point. Royal appearance should be almost supernatural, something beyond normal human experience. Monarchs changed clothes multiple times per day. Morning outfit, afternoon outfit, evening outfit, special outfit for religious services, hunting clothes, riding clothes. Each activity required appropriate dress, and each outfit had to demonstrate royal status. This meant maintaining enormous wardrobes. One queen reportedly owned over 300 gowns at the time of her death. Her successor inherited them all, but still commissioned dozens more because fashion changed constantly, and wearing outdated styles suggested weakness or poverty. Being behind in fashion meant being behind in power, at least in the strange logic of royal courts. The cost of maintaining these wardrobes was astronomical. Teams of servants did nothing but care for royal clothing. They brushed velvet to keep it soft. They stored silk wrapped in linen to prevent damage. They added fresh herbs to chests to ward off moths and other insects. They repaired tiny tears and replaced worn sections. Some pieces were so valuable they had detailed records listing every jewel and decoration. If something went missing, investigations could last weeks. Servants were interrogated. Rooms were searched. The loss of even one pearl button was treated like a serious crime. Think about what all this wealth represented to people who saw it. Most subjects of these kingdoms lived in small houses with dirt floors. They owned perhaps the sets of clothing for their entire lives. They ate simple food and considered meat a rare luxury. Then they saw their king or queen in a parade, dressed in silk and gold, covered in jewels, riding a horse whose saddle alone cost more than their village produced in a year. The contrast was intentional and important. Royal wealth had to be so far beyond normal experience that it seemed almost magical. Common people should look at their monarch and see someone fundamentally different from themselves. Someone chosen by God, someone who deserved to rule because they clearly existed on another level of reality. Foreign visitors provided another important audience for displays of wealth. When ambassadors arrived from rival kingdoms, monarchs staged elaborate receptions designed to intimidate and impress. The throne room would be decorated with gold plate and the finest tapestries. The monarch wore their most expensive outfit and heaviest jewelry. Even the guards wore special uniforms just for the occasion. Everything visitors saw was carefully arranged to send a message. This kingdom is rich and powerful. Do not underestimate us. Do not think about starting wars with us. Look at what we spend on decoration and imagine what we spend on armies. Sometimes these displays became competitions between rival courts. If one kingdom's queen appeared wearing an especially impressive crown, the rival kingdom's queen would commission something even more elaborate. Kings compared the size of jewels in their scepters, like children comparing toys. Entire diplomatic incidents arose over who wore the bigger ruby or the more expensive cloak. It sounds petty, and it was, but it was also serious. In a world where perception shaped reality, appearing wealthier than your rival meant something. It suggested divine favor. It implied military strength. It demonstrated that your kingdom had resources to spare on luxuries, which meant it probably had resources for warfare too. Royal treasuries did more than just store wealth. They served as banks, insurance, and emergency funds. When kingdoms faced financial crisis, monarchs could melt down gold plates or pawn jewels to raise cash quickly. During wars, treasury contents paid for armies and supplies. When harvests failed and people starved, royal wealth could be converted to food purchases. The treasure represented security for the entire kingdom, not just personal wealth for the monarch. Of course, this also meant monarchs faced constant pressure to display their wealth while simultaneously preserving it for emergencies. The balance was delicate and not always successful. Some rulers managed their treasuries better than others. Wise monarchs invested in land, trade, and industries that generated steady income. They commissioned beautiful objects that could be admired but also sold if necessary. They maintained detailed inventories and protected their wealth carefully. Less wise rulers spent without thinking, commissioning ever more elaborate luxuries until their treasuries emptied and they faced bankruptcy. Several kingdoms during this period went broke despite enormous natural resources because their monarchs could not control spending on display and luxury. The paradox of royal wealth was that it had to be both seen and protected. Locked away in treasuries, it served as security that demonstrated nothing. Worn and displayed constantly, it impressed audiences but risked damage or theft. Monarchs and their advisors constantly negotiated this tension, which jewels should be worn regularly, which should stay locked up except for the most important occasions. How much gold should be fashioned into useful objects like plates and cups, and how much should remain as coins? These were not trivial questions. They affected kingdom finances, diplomatic relationships, and even military readiness. In the end, royal wealth served multiple purposes simultaneously. It proved legitimacy by connecting current rulers to ancestral treasure and traditional symbols. It demonstrated power by displaying resources in visible, impressive forms. It provided security by serving as stored value that could be liquidated during emergencies. It intimidated rivals by suggesting unlimited resources and divine favor. And it created psychological distance between monarchs and subjects by making rulers seem almost superhuman in their splendor. Every jewel in every crown, every thread of gold in every robe, every pearl on every button contributed to a carefully constructed image of power. Royal wealth was never just about money. It was about creating and maintaining the idea that some people were born to rule, blessed by God, and impossible to challenge. The gold and jewels were tools in a much larger game of power and control that defined European monarchy for centuries. By mid-morning, the public ceremonies end and real work begins. The monarch moves from the bedchamber to the council chamber, a smaller room designed for serious discussion rather than display. Heavy wooden doors close, guards take positions outside. What happens next shapes the fate of entire kingdoms, yet most people never witness it. This is where kings and queens actually govern, making decisions about war, peace, taxes, laws, and justice. The morning rituals prepared the monarch for this moment. Now comes the difficult part, running a kingdom. The Royal Council meets here several times per week. This group of advisors includes the most powerful and trusted people in the realm. The Chancellor, who manages finances and administration. The Marshal, who commands military forces. The Chief Justice, who oversees the legal system. Various dukes and nobles who represent important regions. And usually a few clergy members who provide religious guidance and legitimacy. These people hold real power. They control armies, collect taxes, manage territories, and influence thousands of decisions. The monarch rules, but the council makes governance actually function. Meetings follow careful protocol. The monarch sits at the head of a long table. Council members arrange themselves according to rank and importance. The Chancellor sits close to the monarch because his advice matters most for daily administration. Military commanders sit nearby because wars constantly threaten. Lesser nobles sit farther away, but their presence still matters. They represent powerful families and important regions. Ignoring them risks rebellion. Including them creates loyalty. Every seat assignment sends a message about who has influence and who does not. The agenda covers everything, from major military campaigns to minor disputes between nobles. Today the council discusses tax collection. Several provinces report poor harvests. Farmers cannot pay what they owe. Should the monarch reduce taxes and risk running out of money for the army? Or demand full payment and risk angry peasants who might revolt? There are no easy answers. The Chancellor argues for strict collection. The treasury needs money. The military marshal agrees. Armies require constant funding, but a duke whose lands face the worst harvests warns that pushing too hard could cause rebellion. He knows his people. Push them too far, and they will fight back. The monarch must decide. This is what ruling actually means. Not wearing fancy clothes or sitting on thrones, but making difficult choices with incomplete information and no perfect options. Choose wrong and people die, territories revolt, or enemies invade. Choose right and the kingdom prospers, at least until the next crisis arrives tomorrow. The pressure is constant and enormous. Council members offer advice, but ultimate responsibility falls on the monarch alone. History will remember their name, not the chancellors or marshals. Success brings glory, failure brings shame and possibly assassination. After tax discussion comes military planning. Reports arrive from border regions. Enemy troops gather nearby. Are they preparing to invade? Or just conducting exercises? Should the kingdom mobilize its own forces? That costs enormous amounts of money and disrupts farming as soldiers leave their fields. But waiting too long to prepare could mean invasion catches the kingdom defenseless. The marshal spreads maps across the table. He points to likely attack routes. He estimates enemy strength. He recommends moving troops to defensive positions. The cost will be huge. The disruption will anger nobles and peasants alike. But the alternative might be losing territory or worse. Again, the monarch must decide. Council members debate. Some urge caution. War costs too much. The treasury cannot afford it. Maybe diplomacy can resolve the situation. Others demand immediate military action. Show strength now or enemies will see weakness and attack anyway. The argument goes back and forth. Voices rise. Fists pound the table. These are not calm academic discussions. These are desperate attempts to find the least bad option among many terrible choices. The monarch listens to everyone, weighs the options, and finally announces a decision. Troops will deploy but not yet attack. A defensive position that shows readiness without committing to full war. It is a compromise that satisfies nobody completely, but perhaps prevents disaster. Next comes the endless stream of petitions and requests. Nobles want permission to marry their children to each other. These marriages create alliances that shift power balances throughout the kingdom. Approve the wrong marriage, and so powerful families unite against the crown. Deny the wrong marriage, and offend nobles who might rebel. Each request requires careful consideration of family histories, current alliances, and future implications. The Chancellor maintains detailed records of every noble family, their lands, their wealth, their relationships. He consults these records constantly during petition review. One wrong decision about a marriage could destabilize the entire kingdom. Religious matters demand attention too. The church wants permission to build a new cathedral. That means granting land and probably providing some funding. In return, the church offers prayers and public support for the monarchy. But cathedrals cost enormous amounts of money and take decades to build. Is this really the best use of royal resources right now? Yet refusing the church risks their anger and potentially their opposition. The clergy member on the council argues passionately for approval. The Chancellor argues just as passionately about costs. The monarch must balance spiritual concerns against practical finances. Welcome to governance. Foreign ambassadors wait in another room for their audiences. Each represents a different kingdom with different interests and demands. One wants to discuss a trade agreement. Another comes to complain about border raids. A third hints at possible military alliance. Each conversation is diplomatic negotiation, requiring extreme care. Say the wrong thing and you create enemies. Promise too much and you cannot deliver. promise too little and opportunities vanish. The monarch must remember dozens of ongoing negotiations, countless treaties, and the complex web of alliances and rivalries that define international relations. One mistaken phrase could start a war or ruin trade that funds the entire kingdom. Between official meetings come the informal conversations that often matter more. A duke pulls the monarch aside. He whispers about another noble plotting rebellion. Is this true? Or is the duke trying to eliminate a rival by making false accusations? Either way, the monarch must investigate carefully, ignore a real plot and face rebellion, act on false information and punish an innocent person, creating genuine enemies where none existed before. Intelligence gathering becomes crucial. Spies operate throughout the kingdom and in foreign courts. They report what they hear, but their information is never complete and not always accurate. The monarch must make decisions based on rumors, partial truths, and calculated guesses. Favorites and personal advisors play complicated roles. Every monarch has people they trust more than others. Sometimes these are childhood friends, sometimes lovers, sometimes just people who prove their loyalty over years of service. These favorites gain enormous influence because they have regular private access to the monarch. Other nobles resent this and plot against the favorites. The council chamber fills with tension between official advisors and unofficial favorites. Everyone competes for royal attention and approval. Everyone wants their advice to be followed. The monarch must navigate these personalities carefully. Favor someone too much and others feel excluded. Spread attention to evenly and nobody feels special enough to risk everything for the crown. By afternoon, exhaustion sets in. Hours of meetings, decisions, arguments, and negotiations drain even the strongest minds. But the work continues. More petitions arrive. More crises demand attention. A merchant guild complains about new regulations. A provincial governor reports problems with local justice. Two nobles nearly fought a duel over an insult and need royal intervention. Each issue seems small individually, but collectively they represent the daily reality of governance. If the monarch ignores these problems, they grow into larger crises. But addressing every single problem means never finishing the work. There are always more petitions, more complaints, more requests. Through all of this, the monarch must project confidence and control. Council members watch for any sign of weakness or uncertainty. Show doubt, and they question your fitness to rule. Admit mistakes, and they wonder if you make mistakes about bigger things too. Royal authority depends partly on appearance. The monarch must seem to always know the right answer, even when they have no idea. This means carefully managing facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language during even the most stressful moments. Inside you might be terrified about military threats or financial collapse. Outside you must look calm, certain, and completely in control. The council chamber reveals the truth about monarchy that public ceremonies conceal. Ruling is not glamorous. It is exhausting, stressful, and filled with impossible choices. The jewels and silk that impressed everyone during morning rituals mean nothing here. What matters is judgment, experience, intelligence, and the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. Some monarchs excel at governance. They master the details of administration, military strategy, diplomacy, and law. They make good decisions more often than bad ones. They build prosperous kingdoms and win wars. Others fail completely. They trust the wrong advisors, make terrible choices, and watch their kingdoms collapse into rebellion and invasion. Nobody sees most of this work. The common people who cheered during morning parades never enter the council chamber. They never witness the arguments, the difficult decisions, or the constant pressure. They see only the results. Taxes go up or down. Wars start or end. Laws change. They judge the monarch based on outcomes, without understanding the process that created those outcomes. Was the king wise or foolish? Was the queen strong or weak? People form opinions based on results, not effort. A monarch who works tirelessly but makes one major mistake might be remembered as incompetent. Another who barely tries but gets lucky might be remembered as brilliant. By late afternoon, the official council meeting finally ends. But the monarch's political work continues: private audiences with important nobles, quiet conversations with advisors about sensitive matters, review of documents requiring royal signature and seal, letters to foreign courts that must be carefully worded, financial accounts that need examination, military reports that demand attention. The work never truly stops. Even during meals, during entertainment, during supposedly private time, political considerations intrude. That noble at dinner wants something. This visitor brings news that changes everything. Those two advisors in the corner appear to be plotting something. This is the reality behind the magnificent facade. The council chamber, not the throne room, is where actual power operates. The decisions made behind closed doors, not the ceremonies performed in public, determine the fate of kingdoms. All the gold and jewels and elaborate rituals serve to create an image of power. But real power is messier, harder, and far less glamorous. It is difficult conversations about impossible choices. It is balancing competing interests with no way to satisfy everyone. It is living with decisions that might have been wrong. It is constant pressure and endless work and very little rest. The crown is heavy not because of the gold, but because of everything it represents. And that weight presses down every single day, in meetings that never end and decisions that never get easier. No matter how long you rule, power does strange things to people. When you control entire kingdoms and nobody can tell you no, unusual behaviors become not just possible, but almost inevitable. European monarchs between the 14th and 18th centuries developed some truly remarkable habits and obsessions. Some collected exotic animals. Others became convinced of bizarre ideas that nobody dared contradict. A few developed eating habits that shocked even their own courts. These were not ordinary people living ordinary lives. They were rulers with unlimited resources and minimal restraint. The results were sometimes entertaining, sometimes disturbing, and always fascinating. Consider royal collections. Many monarchs assembled enormous collections of unusual objects. One king filled entire rooms with mechanical devices, clocks, automata, music boxes, and machines that served no practical purpose, but were marvelous to observe. He spent hours watching gears turn and springs release. Servants wound hundreds of clocks daily. The palace constantly filled with ticking, chiming, and mechanical music. Visitors found it overwhelming. The king found it soothing. He claimed the predictable movements of machines helped him think clearly about the unpredictable movements of politics and war. Another monarch collected exotic animals from around the world. His palace grounds became a private zoo containing creatures most people in that era never imagined existed. Lions from distant southern lands, bears from northern forests, birds with impossible colors, even a creature that looked like a horse with stripes, brought by traders who sailed 4 months to acquire it. The king spent enormous sums purchasing these animals, and even more maintaining them. Special keepers fed them, physicians treated their illnesses. Some animals had better living conditions than most peasants. When particularly rare creatures died, the king reportedly mourned them as if they were family members. Food obsessions affected several monarchs. One queen refused to eat anything unless it was prepared by a specific cook who had served her family for decades. When that cook died, the queen nearly starved herself because she claimed no other food tasted safe or proper. Eventually, another cook learned to replicate the deceased chef's methods exactly, but only after weeks of the queen barely eating. This was not mere preference. This was genuine terror about food poisoning, combined with deep attachment to familiar tastes from childhood. The queen's advisors worried constantly about her health during this period. Another ruler developed the opposite problem. He ate constantly and in enormous quantities. Breakfast lasted to hours and included more food than most families ate in a week. Lunch was even larger. Dinner became a marathon event stretching late into the evening. Between formal meals he demanded snacks. Servants carried food everywhere he went. He ate during council meetings, during religious services, sometimes even while giving audiences to foreign ambassadors. His physicians warned him constantly about his health. He ignored them completely. Food represented power, abundance, and security to him. The more he ate, the more successful he felt as a ruler. Some monarchs developed peculiar beliefs that shaped their daily lives in strange ways. One king became convinced that bathing caused illness. This was not unusual for the era, but he took it further than most. He refused to let water touch his body for years at a time. Instead, servants rubbed him with dry cloths and applied heavy perfumes. The smell became legendary. People could detect his presence from distant rooms. Foreign ambassadors reported the odor to their home courts in diplomatic correspondence. But nobody could convince the king otherwise. He pointed to his relatively good health as proof that avoiding water worked. The fact that many people who did bathe also stayed healthy did not change his mind. Another monarch became obsessed with astrology and prophecy. She refused to make any important decision without consulting astrologers first. Military campaigns waited for favorable star alignments. Diplomatic meetings were scheduled according to cosmic predictions. Even meals followed astrological recommendations about which foods matched her birth chart on specific days. The court astrologer wielded enormous power because the queen trusted his interpretations completely. Other advisors resented this influence but could not overcome it. The queen genuinely believed the stars guided her destiny and that ignoring them invited disaster. Architectural obsessions consumed some rulers entirely. One king constantly renovated his palaces, never satisfied with any design for long. He would order one wing built in a particular style, then change his mind halfway through construction and demand something completely different. Builders worked 4 years on projects that were demolished before completion. The waste of resources was staggering. His advisors pleaded with him to finish one project before starting another. He ignored them. The constant building made him happy. It gave him a sense of creation and control. If governing a kingdom felt overwhelming and uncertain, at least he could control architecture, walls, and towers that did exactly what he commanded. Sleep habits varied dramatically among monarchs. One queen slept only 3 or 4 hours per night, rising before dawn and working until midnight. She claimed sleep was wasted time when so much needed to be done. Her energy amazed everyone. Servants struggled to keep up with her schedule. Council members arrived exhausted to early morning meetings where she appeared fresh and eager to work. Some suspected she used herbal stimulants. Others thought she simply possessed unusual natural energy. Either way, her sleep pattern was dramatically different from most people and gave her extra hours for work and leisure that others lacked. Conversely, another monarch loved sleep so much that he spent half the day in bed. Morning ceremonies did not start until noon. Council meetings happened in late afternoon. Evening entertainment extended past midnight because he woke so late. The entire court adjusted its schedule to match his preferences. He claimed that sleeping long hours improved his judgment and health. Whether true or not, nobody could argue with a king who refused to rise earlier. The kingdom functioned despite this unusual schedule, proving that royal routines could adapt to almost any personal preference. Some rulers developed obsessions with specific activities or hobbies. One king spent hours daily practicing calligraphy, trying to perfect his handwriting. He produced thousands of pages of carefully written text, copying religious works, philosophical treatises, and sometimes just writing the same phrases repeatedly to improve letter formation. His handwriting did become extraordinarily beautiful. But the time spent on this activity took away from governance. Advisors managed many daily matters without consulting him because he was occupied with ink and paper. Another monarch became passionate about hunting, but took it to extremes. Hunting expeditions lasted weeks. The king insisted on pursuing dangerous animals personally, rather than letting trained hunters take the risks. He suffered numerous injuries over the years: broken bones, deep cuts. Once he nearly died from infection after a wild boar gored his leg. His council begged him to hunt more safely. He refused. The thrill of danger made him feel alive in ways that sitting on a throne never did. For him, confronting death in the forest meant more than any amount of political power. Garden design captivated one queen to an almost maniacal degree. She designed elaborate formal gardens with geometric precision. Thousands of plants arranged in exact patterns. Fountains placed according to mathematical calculations. Paths that created specific visual effects from certain viewpoints. She spent hours each day inspecting the gardens, ordering tiny adjustments. One plant placed incorrectly could upset her for days. Gardeners lived in constant fear of her displeasure. But the gardens became famous throughout Europe, attracting visitors who marveled at their beauty and complexity. The Queen's obsession created something genuinely magnificent, even if it consumed excessive time and resources. Religious devotion took unusual forms among some monarchs. One king attended religious services 5 or 6 times daily. Morning prayers, midday mass, afternoon devotions, evening vespers, late-night prayers. He spent more time in the chapel than anywhere else. Between services, he read religious texts and met with spiritual advisors. Governing became secondary to worship. His advisors essentially ran the kingdom, while he focused on saving his soul. Whether this made him a bad king or a holy one depends on your perspective. The kingdom functioned. But the king's priorities were certainly unusual for a monarch expected to focus on earthly power. Fashion obsessions affected several rulers. One queen changed outfits 6 or 7 times daily, never wearing the same gown twice in a month. Her wardrobe required dozens of servants just to manage. Seamstresses worked constantly producing new garments. The expense was astronomical. But the Queen believed that constantly updated fashion demonstrated vitality and relevance. Standing still in style meant decline in power. She had to always appear at the cutting edge of every fashion trend, setting examples that others rushed to follow. Some monarchs developed unusual relationships with their advisors that crossed normal boundaries. One king treated his favorite counselor almost as an equal, dining with him privately, sharing personal confidences, even asking his opinion on family matters. This horrified other nobles, who felt the counselor had risen far above his proper station. They plotted against him constantly. Eventually, he fell from favor spectacularly when a rival finally convinced the king of some misdeed. But 4 years, the unusual friendship gave the counselor more power than many nobles with ancient lineage and vast lands. Perhaps the strangest habit involved one monarch who refused to sit on his throne. He claimed it was uncomfortable and old-fashioned. Instead, he conducted audiences while pacing around the throne room. Foreign ambassadors found this disconcerting. They expected to approach a seated monarch on an elevated throne. Instead, they met a king wandering around, sometimes even walking behind them while they spoke. It violated every protocol of proper royal ceremony. His advisors tried repeatedly to convince him to sit properly. He refused. The throne was symbolic furniture, he argued. Real power did not require sitting on special chairs. These behaviors might seem merely odd or amusing, but they reveal something important about monarchy in this era. With absolute power came the freedom to indulge personal preferences, regardless of social norms. Monarchs could shape their entire courts around their individual habits and obsessions. If a queen wanted gardens arranged just so, thousands of plants were moved. If a king wanted exotic animals, ships sailed around the world to acquire them. The only real limit was what the treasury could afford and what would not trigger rebellion. Within those broad boundaries, monarchs could be as eccentric as they wished. These strange habits also humanized rulers who otherwise seemed distant and untouchable. A king who collected mechanical toys or a queen who mourned dead animals, revealed personality beneath the crown. They were not just symbols of power, but actual people with quirks, fears, passions, and obsessions. Knowing this made them simultaneously more relatable and more mysterious. If they were human enough to have bizarre hobbies, they were also human enough to make mistakes in governance. But their power meant those mistakes affected entire kingdoms. An ordinary person obsessed with astrology would simply make bad personal decisions. A queen obsessed with astrology might start wars or sign treaties based on star charts. The stakes of royal eccentricity were always extremely high, which is perhaps what makes these stories so compelling centuries later. Power combined with personality created rulers who were never boring, even if they were sometimes deeply strange. Marriage among royalty had nothing to do with romance. It was diplomacy by another name, a tool for creating alliances, securing peace, or claiming territories. When monarchs arranged marriages for their children, they consulted maps and treaties, not the preferences of those actually getting married. A princess born into a royal family understood from childhood that her future husband would be chosen for political reasons, not personal compatibility. Love, if it happened at all, was considered a pleasant bonus rather than a requirement. The primary purpose of royal marriage was securing the dynasty and strengthening the kingdom. Negotiations for royal marriages could take years. Ambassadors traveled between courts carrying proposals and counter-proposals. They discussed dowries, which were enormous sums of money or valuable territories given by the bride's family. They negotiated what titles the bride would hold in her new kingdom. They determined what rights her children would have to inherit lands or thrones. Every detail mattered because these marriages bound kingdoms together legally and politically. Breaking a marriage agreement could mean war. Fulfilling it could mean decades of peace and profitable alliance. Consider a typical scenario. Two kingdoms have been rivals for generations, occasionally fighting wars over disputed border territories. Both sides are exhausted and want peace, but neither wants to appear weak. The solution: a marriage between the crown prince of one kingdom and the princess of another. Suddenly, instead of enemies, the two royal families become relatives. The disputed territories can be settled through negotiation rather than warfare, because now both sides have family connections. The children born from this marriage will have legitimate claims to both kingdoms, potentially uniting them under one rule eventually. One marriage solves multiple political problems simultaneously. But what about the people actually getting married? Often they had never met before their wedding day. Sometimes they did not even speak the same language. A princess raised in one kingdom with specific customs and traditions suddenly found herself transported to a completely foreign court where everything worked differently. The food tasted strange, the religious practices varied slightly. The court etiquette followed different rules. She had to learn a new language, adapt to new expectations, and somehow build a life among people she barely knew. And she had to do all of this while knowing that her primary duty was producing heirs, particularly male heirs who could continue the dynasty. The pressure on royal brides was immense. Everyone watched and waited for pregnancy announcements. If a queen or princess did not conceive quickly, rumors spread. Was she unable to have children? Was the marriage not being properly consummated? Political advisors worried because dynasties needed heirs. Without children, the succession became uncertain, which could trigger civil war when the current monarch died. So royal women faced constant scrutiny about their bodies and their fertility in ways that seem shocking by modern standards. Their success or failure was measured largely by their ability to produce sons who could inherit thrones. Some royal marriages worked surprisingly well despite their political origins. Couples who married for diplomatic reasons sometimes developed genuine affection over years together. Shared experiences, children, and mutual respect could create bonds even when romance was never the goal. Other marriages remained coldly political throughout, with spouses maintaining separate households and rarely spending time together except for formal occasions and the necessary attempts to produce heirs. And some marriages became genuinely miserable, with couples who disliked each other forced to remain married, because divorce was nearly impossible for royalty without causing massive political complications. Distance complicated many marriages. Princesses married to foreign rulers often never saw their birth families again. Travel was difficult, expensive, and dangerous in this era. A princess who married into a kingdom several weeks' journey away might live the rest of her life without seeing her parents or siblings again. Letters took months to arrive. News from home was always old by the time it reached her. This isolation was part of the sacrifice expected from royal women. They were diplomatic tools who belonged to their new kingdoms now, not their old ones. Their loyalty had to be to their husbands' families and territories, even if it meant abandoning everyone they grew up with. Age differences in royal marriages could be extreme. It was not uncommon for much older men to marry very young women, especially when political needs were urgent. Sometimes brides were barely teenagers, while their husbands were middle-aged or elderly. These marriages had obvious power imbalances. Young brides had little influence over their much older, more experienced husbands and their courts. They had to navigate complicated political situations with minimal preparation or support. If the husband died while the bride was still young, she might find herself a widow with children to protect in a foreign court where she had few true allies. Multiple marriages happened frequently because people died younger in this era. A king might outlive 2 or 3 wives and marry each time for different political reasons. His first marriage created an alliance with one kingdom. His second marriage, after his first wife died, brought wealth and territory. His third marriage secured peace with a former enemy. Each new marriage shifted political calculations and created new sets of alliances and obligations. Children from different marriages sometimes competed for inheritance, creating succession disputes that could tear kingdoms apart. Royal families became incredibly complex webs of half-siblings, step-parents, and competing claims to power. Dowries represented enormous wealth changing hands. A princess marrying into a foreign kingdom typically brought a dowry that might include gold, jewels, annual payments of money, or even entire cities and provinces. These dowries served multiple purposes. They compensated the groom's family for taking on responsibility for the bride. They demonstrated the bride's family's wealth and power. And they gave the bride some economic security in her new home. If she became a widow, her dowry provided income for her support. If the marriage ended badly, the return of the dowry could be negotiated as part of the settlement. Some marriages specifically aim to unite rival claims to territories or thrones. If the families both claimed the right to rule a particular kingdom, one way to resolve the dispute was marrying members of the two families together. Their children would then carry the blood of both claimants, potentially satisfying both sides. This was elegant in theory, but messy in practice. Families rarely forgot their old rivalries just because of a marriage. They continued competing for influence over the married couple and their children. The children themselves might face divided loyalties, pulled between their mother's family and their father's family, each expecting different things. Royal marriage ceremonies were massive public events designed to display wealth and seal political agreements with maximum visibility. The wedding celebrations might last 4 days or even weeks. Tournaments, banquets, religious services, public processions, and theatrical performances entertained thousands of guests from across Europe. The expense was staggering, but the investment was necessary. These weddings announced new alliances to the world. They demonstrated that both families considered this union important enough to spend lavishly on celebrations, and they provided opportunities for other diplomatic negotiations as foreign royalty and nobles gathered in one place. After marriage, royal couples faced expectations about their relationship that differed significantly from marriages among common people. They were expected to produce heirs, certainly, but they were also expected to maintain the dignity and reputation of their dynasties. Public displays of affection were generally considered inappropriate. Married royalty conducted themselves with formality and distance in public, saving any genuine emotional connection for private moments, if it existed at all. The marriage was too important politically to be treated casually. It represented alliances, treaties, and the future of entire kingdoms. Personal feelings had to be subordinated to these larger concerns. Infidelity was common among royal couples, though treated very differently for men and women. Kings routinely took mistresses, and while this might cause personal hurt to their wives, it rarely created political problems as long as legitimate heirs existed. Queens who had affairs, however, faced much more serious consequences. A queen's infidelity threatened the legitimacy of heirs. If questions arose about whether her children were actually fathered by the king, succession became uncertain and politically dangerous. Queens suspected of infidelity could be imprisoned, exiled, or worse. The double standard was extreme, but it reflected the political reality that royal paternity mattered enormously, while maternal lineage was easier to verify. Some princesses became political pawns multiple times in their lives. A princess might be betrothed as a child to one foreign prince, then have that engagement broken for political reasons and be engaged to someone completely different. If her first husband died, she might be married again to another political ally. Her preferences and feelings throughout these multiple arrangements rarely mattered. She was valuable because of her royal blood and the alliances her marriages could create. Her personal desires were secondary to the needs of her birth family's kingdom and whatever kingdoms she married into. Despite all the political calculation, some royal marriages became genuine partnerships. Couples who married for diplomatic reasons sometimes discovered they respected each other's intelligence and capabilities. Kings consulted their foreign-born queens about diplomatic matters relating to the queen's home kingdom. Queens managed their husbands' courts effectively during the king's absences. These partnerships could be quite successful even without romantic love. Mutual respect and shared interests in their children's welfare created working relationships that benefited both spouses and their kingdoms. The children of these diplomatic marriages grew up knowing their own marriages would be arranged the same way. Royal children were raised understanding that they were valuable political assets. Their bloodlines, their claims to territories, and their potential for creating alliances made them too important to marry for love. This was simply how monarchy worked. Generation after generation repeated the same pattern. Political necessity shaped family bonds, marriage was diplomacy, and personal happiness was at best a secondary concern. The system continued because it worked. Marriages really did create alliances, secure peace treaties, and unite rival claims. The human cost was high, especially for the women who found themselves far from home in foreign courts. But from the perspective of dynasty and state, royal marriage achieved exactly what it was designed to do. It bound kingdoms together through blood and law in ways that shaped the political map of Europe for centuries. Royal courts between 1400 and 1700 were dangerous places. Behind the magnificent ceremonies and elaborate etiquette, constant competition for power created an atmosphere of suspicion and conspiracy. Nobles plotted against each other. Advisors schemed for influence. Foreign agents gathered intelligence. And occasionally, people disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. The stakes were enormous. Success in court politics could mean wealth, titles, and power for your entire family. Failure could mean exile, imprisonment, or execution. In this environment, trust was rare and alliances shifted constantly. The struggle for royal favor drove much of court intrigue. Every noble wanted access to the monarch because proximity to power meant actual power. If the king trusted your advice, you could shape policy. If the queen preferred your company, you could influence appointments and decisions. Competition for these positions was ruthless. Nobles spread rumors about rivals, questioned their loyalty, and looked for any weakness that could be exploited. One well-placed piece of gossip could destroy a career that took decades to build. Factions formed naturally at every court. Some nobles supported aggressive foreign policy, while others preferred diplomacy. Some wanted higher taxes to fund military expansion, while others represented regions that could not afford more taxation. Religious differences created additional divisions. Each faction worked to place their supporters in important positions and remove rivals from influence. The monarch had to balance these competing groups carefully. Favor one faction too much, and the others might rebel. Ignore legitimate concerns, and you create genuine enemies. Favorites represented a particular source of tension. When a monarch clearly preferred certain advisors or companions, others felt excluded and resentful. These favorites gained enormous influence, sometimes more than people with higher official rank. Other nobles plotted constantly to remove favorites from power. They looked for evidence of corruption or disloyalty. They whispered warnings to the monarch about trusting one person too much. Sometimes they succeeded in toppling favorites, who fell from grace as quickly as they had risen. Other times, attempting to remove a favorite only strengthened their position by revealing the plots against them. Spying was constant and accepted as normal. Every significant noble maintained a network of informants. Servants reported what they overheard in private chambers. Lesser nobles observed conversations at court and passed information to their patrons. Foreign ambassadors sent home detailed reports about court politics, personal relationships, and potential opportunities for their own kingdoms to exploit. Information was currency in this environment. Knowing what others planned gave you advantage in countering their moves or joining their conspiracies if it suited your interests. Secret meetings happened regularly despite all the observation. Nobles would arrange to accidentally encounter each other in gardens or chapels where conversations might go unnoticed. They sent coded letters using trusted messengers. They communicated through intermediaries who could deny involvement if schemes were discovered. The elaborate protocols of court life that seemed designed for public display also created opportunities for private communication. During large ceremonies and celebrations, when hundreds of people gathered, whispered conversations in corners or behind pillars could go unnoticed in the controlled chaos. Marriage alliances within the courts created complex webs of loyalty and conflict. When nobles married their children to each other, they formed political partnerships, but these partnerships could shift. If to allied families both wanted the same position or disagreed about policy, yesterday's allies became today's rivals. Family relationships did not guarantee trust or support. Brothers competed against brothers for inheritance and favor. Parents and children sometimes found themselves on opposite sides of court factions. Blood relations mattered, but political interests often mattered more. Financial disputes sparked many court conflicts. Positions at court came with salaries, lands, and opportunities for additional income. Nobles competed fiercely for these lucrative appointments. They also competed for royal gifts and grants of land or income. The monarch had limited resources to distribute, which meant every grant to one person was something denied to others. Those who felt they deserved rewards but were passed over for less worthy rivals nursed resentments that could last 4 years and explode into open conflict given the right circumstances. Religious tensions added another dangerous layer to court politics. In an era of religious division and reform, questions of faith had political implications. Nobles of different religious orientations naturally distrusted each other and competed for influence. They accused rivals of insufficient devotion or suspect loyalties. They suggested that religious differences meant political disloyalty. Monarchs trying to maintain peace had to navigate these religious factions carefully, which was not always possible when the kingdom itself was divided on religious questions. Succession crises brought out the worst court intrigues. When a monarch had no clear heir, or when multiple people had potential claims to the throne, factions formed around different candidates. Each side worked to position their preferred successor advantageously. They arranged marriages to strengthen claims. They built military alliances in case succession needed to be decided by force. They spread rumors questioning the legitimacy of rival claimants. These struggles could begin years before a monarch's death and sometimes erupted into civil war when the throne finally became vacant. Foreign influence complicated domestic court politics. Other kingdoms had interests in who held power in rival nations. They sent ambassadors who were also intelligence agents, gathering information and cultivating relationships with nobles who might support foreign interests. Sometimes foreign powers bribed court officials or promised support for their ambitions in exchange for favorable policies. Nobles desperate for advantage in domestic struggles sometimes made deals with foreign agents, trading information or political support for money, military assistance, or promises of titles and lands. These arrangements were treason if discovered, but tempting when domestic rivals seemed too powerful to overcome alone. Women at court played significant but complicated roles in political intrigue. Queens and noble women could not hold most official positions, but they wielded influence through relationships and information networks. They built alliances through marriages they arranged for their children. They gathered intelligence from other women, from servants, and from nobles who underestimated female political skill. Some queens essentially ran shadow governments through their household officials and personal advisors. Their rivals, recognizing this hidden power, worked to isolate them or turn the monarch against them. Court politics among women could be just as complex and ruthless as politics among men, but it operated through different channels and with different tools. Letters were dangerous. Written communication left evidence that could be used against you if plans went wrong. People plotting against each other or against the monarch had to be extremely careful about what they wrote down. They used codes, destroyed correspondence, or communicated only verbally through trusted intermediaries. When conspiracies were uncovered, investigators examined letters and documents looking for evidence of treason or disloyalty. A carelessly worded letter from years earlier could be reinterpreted as proof of conspiracy when political circumstances changed. Timing mattered enormously in court intrigue. Making your move too early meant acting before you had sufficient support, which led to failure and punishment. Waiting too long meant rivals moved first or circumstances changed, making your plans irrelevant. Reading the political situation correctly required skill, intelligence networks, and often luck. Some nobles excelled at this political timing, rising to power by knowing exactly when to support rising factions and when to abandon falling ones. Others miscalculated and lost everything. The physical layout of palaces affected political intrigue. Knowing the building's hidden passages, which rooms connected to which others, and where private conversations might happen safely gave advantages. Some nobles cultivated relationships with palace servants who controlled access to different areas. Being able to arrange an unobserved meeting or learning about meetings you were excluded from could provide crucial intelligence about developing plots or opportunities. Personal charisma and social skills shaped political success. Nobles who could make people like them, who told good stories, who remembered personal details about others, and who made others feel important gained advantages over rivals who relied solely on family connections or official position. Court society rewarded those who could navigate social interactions skillfully. A well-timed compliment, a favor done quietly, or remembering someone's birthday could build relationships that became political assets later. Alliances between unlikely partners sometimes emerged from practical necessity. To nobles who disliked each other might temporarily cooperate against a common rival who threatened both their interests. These alliances of convenience were fragile and lasted only as long as the common threat persisted. Once their mutual enemy fell, yesterday's partners often became tomorrow's competitors. But in court politics, Permanent enemies and permanent friends rarely existed. Only permanent interests existed, and those shifted with circumstances. The constant intrigue exhausted even successful courtiers. Always watching what you said, always evaluating others' motives, always planning several moves ahead, required tremendous mental energy. Trust was difficult when betrayal was common, and when friendships often concealed political calculation. Some nobles thrived in this environment, treating court politics like an elaborate game they played skillfully. Others found the constant suspicion and competition emotionally draining. Many eventually retired to their country estates, claiming they preferred rural peace to court life, though sometimes retirement was forced after political defeats. Monarchs themselves were both victims and beneficiaries of court intrigue. They relied on competing factions to govern effectively, playing sides against each other to maintain control. But they also had to guard against plots targeting them directly. Paranoid monarchs saw conspiracies everywhere and punished people for suspected disloyalty based on minimal evidence. This created genuine conspiracies by giving people legitimate fear about their safety. More secure monarchs tolerated a certain amount of court competition while watching carefully for real threats. Succession crises triggered some of the bloodiest conflicts in European history. When a monarch died without a clear heir, or when multiple people claimed legitimate rights to the throne, kingdoms could descend into civil war. These were not abstract political disputes. They were conflicts where brothers fought brothers, cousins battled cousins, and entire families destroyed each other in pursuit of crowns. The violence was personal and brutal because the stakes were absolute. Win and you controlled a kingdom, lose and you faced exile, imprisonment, or execution. There was no middle ground when competing for thrones. Family relationships became weapons in succession disputes. A claimant with royal blood through their mother might face a rival who descended from the previous king's brother. Each side hired lawyers and scholars to argue why their bloodline was superior, their claim more legitimate. They produced genealogies going back generations, trying to prove their connection to ancient rulers. They cited old laws and precedents. But ultimately, when multiple people had reasonable claims, military force often decided the outcome rather than legal arguments. The side with more soldiers, better generals, and stronger alliances typically prevailed regardless of whose claim was technically stronger. Preparing for succession wars began long before monarchs died. Rival claimants built alliances years in advance. They married strategically to gain powerful in-laws who would support their claims with troops and money. They cultivated relationships with nobles, offering promises of lands, titles, and positions in exchange for future military support. They secured foreign backing, convincing other kingdoms that supporting their claims served foreign interests. By the time a succession actually became contested, the competing sides had often been organizing for years. The death of a monarch without sons created particularly complex situations. In most kingdoms, women could not inherit thrones directly, though this rule varied. When a king died leaving only daughters, who should rule? The eldest daughter's husband, the dead king's brother. The daughter's son once he came of age. Different factions supported different answers, each with arguments about tradition, law, and practicality. These disputes dragged kingdoms into decades of conflict, as each side refused to accept the other's legitimacy. Religious authority became crucial in succession disputes. The church's blessing added legitimacy to claims. Coronations performed by senior clergy implied divine approval. Rival claimants competed for ecclesiastical support, each trying to convince church leaders that their claim was righteous and their rivals' claims were invalid. Popes and bishops sometimes played kingmakers, though their interference could backfire if it seemed too politically motivated rather than spiritually guided. Civil wars over succession devastated entire kingdoms. Armies marched back and forth across territories, destroying crops, burning villages, and disrupting trade. Farmers abandoned fields because fighting made planting and harvesting impossible. Cities were besieged, sometimes for months or years. The economic damage lasted long before the fighting ended. A kingdom torn by civil war might take decades to recover its prosperity. Meanwhile, neighboring kingdoms often took advantage of the chaos to seize disputed border territories, adding territorial loss to the internal destruction. Nobles faced impossible choices during succession wars. Supporting the wrong side meant losing everything if your candidate failed. But remaining neutral risked angering whoever eventually won, who might punish those who refused to help. Many nobles tried to hedge their bets, offering lukewarm support to one side while maintaining secret communications with the other, ready to switch allegiances if the tide turned. This pragmatic disloyalty was understood and expected, though winners sometimes punished those who switched sides too obviously or too late. Foreign intervention complicated succession disputes further. Other kingdoms had strong interests in who won. A friendly monarch on a neighboring throne meant peaceful borders and trade opportunities. An enemy monarch meant constant military tension and possible war. So foreign powers often backed one claimant or another, providing money, troops, or both. Sometimes succession disputes became proxy wars between larger kingdoms, with the actual throne in question almost secondary to the broader international conflict. Women in succession disputes faced unique challenges and opportunities. A queen claiming the throne had to overcome prejudices about female rule, while demonstrating she could command armies and govern effectively. Some succeeded spectacularly, proving themselves shrewd politicians and capable military leaders. Others were used as figureheads by male relatives who claimed to act in their names, while actually holding power themselves. A woman's claim often rested on her marriages and her sons. She might claim on behalf of a young son, acting as regent until he came of age, which gave her temporary authority that some women skillfully converted into lasting influence. Younger brothers caused particular succession problems. If an older brother inherited the throne, should the younger brother receive lands and titles, but accept subordination? Or should he consider himself an alternative heir who deserved equal consideration? Many younger sons felt entitled to more than they received, leading them to cultivate their own power bases and sometimes challenge their brothers openly. These sibling rivalries could explode into full civil war, especially if the older brother died, leaving only young children as heirs, while an adult uncle stood ready to claim he would govern better. Legitimacy questions poisoned some successions. If rumors suggested that an heir was illegitimate, that their royal father had not actually fathered them, their claim to the throne became questionable. Proving legitimacy was often impossible, so these disputes came down to whom nobles chose to believe. Political rivals spread rumors about illegitimacy even without evidence, knowing that suspicion alone could weaken claims. Defending against these accusations was difficult because absolute proof of paternity did not exist in this era. Some succession wars lasted decades, consuming multiple generations. What began as a dispute between two claimants continued with their children and grandchildren. People grew up knowing nothing but war, where family identity was defined by which side their ancestors had supported generations earlier. These prolonged conflicts created deep divisions within kingdoms that persisted long after the fighting finally ended. Old grievances and ancient loyalties shaped politics for centuries. Compromise solutions sometimes ended succession crises without definitive victories. Two rival claimants might agree that one would rule during their lifetime, while the other's child inherited after their death. Or a kingdom might be divided, with different claimants ruling different regions. These compromises satisfied nobody completely, but sometimes prevented further bloodshed. They also created future problems when the terms of compromises were reinterpreted or when new generations decided to restart old conflicts. Military skill mattered enormously in succession wars. A claimant who personally led troops and won battles gained prestige and legitimacy that peaceful rivals could not match. Victory in battle seemed like divine favor, suggesting that God supported this claimant. Meanwhile, claimants who lost battles saw their support crumble as nobles reconsidered whether backing them was wise. A few decisive military victories could settle succession disputes that legal arguments debated for years. Economic resources shaped succession war outcomes. Maintaining armies required enormous amounts of money. Claimants with access to wealthy territories, profitable trade, or foreign financial backing could field larger armies for longer periods. Poor claimants, regardless of how legitimate their claims might be, often lost simply because they ran out of money before achieving victory. War became as much about financial management as military strategy. Children suffered particularly during succession wars. Young heirs became targets. Rival claimants sometimes tried to capture or eliminate children who stood between them and the throne. Families hid young heirs for their safety, spiriting them to distant castles or even foreign kingdoms where rivals could not reach them. Growing up as a threatened heir meant living in fear, never knowing who to trust, and understanding that your very existence represented a political problem that others wanted to solve permanently. Victory in succession wars did not guarantee peace. The winning claimants still faced nobles who had supported rivals, territories devastated by fighting, and neighbors who might challenge a ruler they considered weakened or illegitimate. Many succession war winners spent years consolidating power, punishing defeated rivals, rewarding supporters, and trying to rebuild what the conflict destroyed. Some succeeded in establishing stable rule. Others faced continuing rebellions and resistance from those who never accepted their legitimacy. Historical memory of succession wars shaped kingdoms for generations. Stories of ancestral heroes and villains from these conflicts became family legends. Grudges persisted between families whose ancestors fought on opposite sides decades or centuries earlier. Even successful monarchs who ended succession wars could not erase the memories of destruction and betrayal. The scars remained in family relationships, political alignments, and popular memory long after the actual fighting stopped. The fundamental problem with monarchy created these succession crises repeatedly. Concentrating power in one person worked well when succession was clear, but human biology ensured that succession would regularly become unclear. Kings died without sons. Heirs died before inheriting. Legitimate claims multiplied through marriages and generations until multiple people could argue they deserved thrones. The system that created absolute power also created the conditions for catastrophic civil wars whenever that power transferred between rulers. The bedchamber itself represented enormous luxury. The bed was massive, with heavy curtains that could be drawn closed for privacy and warmth. The mattress contained layers of the finest materials available. Sheets were linen or even silk. Blankets were wool or fur depending on the season. Pillows were stuffed with down feathers. The bed's frame was carved wood, often gilded, with elaborate decorations that demonstrated the craftsman's skill. Some royal beds cost as much as a noble's entire yearly income. They were works of art as much as furniture. The ritual of actually getting into bed followed its own protocol. The monarch did not simply climb in. Servants prepared the bed, smoothing sheets and arranging pillows. They tested that curtains could be drawn properly. They ensured that everything was perfect before the monarch approached. Only then did the ruler climb into bed, still observed by the nobles gathered in the chamber. Even this simple act of lying down was performed with witnesses watching, noting, and remembering. Before sleep, prayers were necessary. A chaplain or religious advisor offered evening prayers, seeking divine protection through the night. These prayers were more personal and less formal than morning religious services, but they still served important purposes. They reinforced the connection between monarchy and divine will. They provided spiritual comfort in an era when death could come suddenly from illness or violence, and they offered a moment of reflection on the day's events and challenges that tomorrow might bring. Some monarchs used these final moments before sleep to give last instructions or make final decisions about matters that had weighed on their minds all day. A trusted advisor might be called close to the bedside for a whispered conversation, while others were dismissed. These private bedside conversations were among the most politically significant moments at court, because they involved the monarch's thoughts when guards were down and exhaustion made true feelings more likely to emerge. The lighting of the bedchamber was carefully managed. Candles provided illumination, but too much light would prevent sleep, while too little created security concerns. Servants positioned candles where they provided enough light for the monarch to see if they woke during the night, but not so much that sleep became difficult. Some candles were left burning all night as a precaution, while others were extinguished after the monarch fell asleep. Managing this lighting was another specialized task, assigned to specific servants who knew exactly how the monarch preferred their sleeping chamber illuminated. Security concerns peaked during sleeping hours. While the monarch slept, they were most vulnerable to attack. Guards were stationed outside the bedchamber doors and in corridors leading to the royal apartments. Trusted servants slept in adjacent rooms, ready to respond to any sounds of trouble. The massive bed curtains provided some protection by concealing the exact location of the sleeping monarch from anyone who somehow entered the room. Multiple locks secured doors. Nothing was left to chance when it came to protecting the sleeping ruler. Some monarchs struggled with sleep despite the luxury of their surroundings. The weight of ruling kingdoms, constant political pressures, threats from rivals, and personal anxieties all contributed to sleeplessness. Physicians prescribed various remedies. Herbal drinks meant to promote sleep. Special foods eaten before bed. Even lullabies sung quietly by musicians positioned in adjacent rooms. The irony was profound. Monarchs surrounded by every comfort and luxury often slept poorly due to the enormous stress their positions created. Dreams troubled some rulers. In an era when people believed dreams carried prophetic significance, a nightmare might be interpreted as a divine warning or bad omen. Court astrologers and religious advisors were sometimes summoned in the morning to interpret disturbing dreams. These interpretations could influence political decisions, military planning, or diplomatic negotiations. A monarch who dreamed of defeat might postpone battle plans. One who dreamed of betrayal might become suspicious of formerly trusted advisors. The sleeping mind shaped waking policy in ways that seem strange by modern standards, but were taken seriously in this period. The silence that fell over the palace after the monarch retired was notable. People spoke in whispers. Movements became quiet and careful. The entire court adjusted its behavior to avoid disturbing the royal rest. This was partly respect and partly self-preservation. A monarch awakened by noise became angry, and that anger could have consequences for whoever was responsible. So the palace that bustled with activity during daytime hours transformed into a hushed, almost eerie space during the night. Not everyone slept when the monarch did. Palace life continued through the night with reduced but essential staff. Kitchen workers prepared food for the next day. Guards maintained their posts. Servants stood ready to respond if the monarch needed anything. The palace never truly closed or stopped functioning. It merely shifted into a nighttime mode where activity continued, but at lower volume and intensity, always ready to snap back to full operation the moment the monarch awakened. Morning seemed impossibly far away during those dark hours before dawn. Yet it would come quickly, beginning the entire cycle again. The lever ceremony would mirror the evening's kucha. The same nobles would attend. The same rituals would be performed. Day after day, week after week, year after year, the pattern repeated with only minor variations. This was the rhythm of royal life, where even the most private moments of waking and sleeping became public ceremonies that served political purposes and reinforced social hierarchies. The kucha ceremony, like the lever, revealed the fundamental nature of absolute monarchy. Privacy did not exist. Personal comfort was always secondary to political necessity. Even sleep, the most universal and basic human need, became another opportunity to display power and status. The monarch was never just a person. They were always the embodiment of the state, the symbol of divine authority, the center around which the entire kingdom revolved. This was true from the moment they woke until the moment they slept. And even sleep itself was not exempt from the demands of ceremony and protocol. As the chamber finally emptied of all but the closest attendants, as the candles were adjusted to their nighttime positions, as the prayers concluded and the bed curtains were drawn, the monarch was left in relative solitude. But even then, servants waited nearby. Guards stood outside. The entire apparatus of royal power surrounded the sleeping figure, protecting it, serving it, and waiting for dawn when the performance would begin again. The crown might rest on a cushion in the treasury. The royal robes might hang in wardrobes, but the weight of monarchy never truly lifted. It pressed down even in sleep, a burden that came with the privilege and power of ruling kingdoms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new ceremonies, new decisions. But tonight, for a few hours, there was darkness, quiet, and the brief escape of sleep. Though even that sleep was never entirely peaceful for those who wore crowns and made choices that shaped the lives of thousands. The final ritual of the day was complete. The monarch slept, and the kingdom waited for morning to come again. As daylight faded, the formal business of governing gave way to evening activities that were equally political but disguised as pleasure. Royal banquets were not simply meals. They were elaborate performances where seating arrangements communicated status, menu choices demonstrated wealth, and every conversation carried diplomatic weight. Entertainment provided opportunities for display and subtle negotiation. Even leisure time at court followed protocols and served purposes beyond simple enjoyment. The evening hours might seem less serious than morning ceremonies or afternoon council meetings, but they were just as carefully orchestrated and just as important for maintaining power. Royal banquets began with ceremony. Guests entered according to strict rank. The highest nobles sat closest to the monarch. Lesser nobles filled tables farther away. Servants carried dishes in precise order, presenting each course first to the monarch before serving others. The food itself was spectacular. Roasted meats from multiple animals, elaborate pies containing whole birds, fish prepared in complex sauces, fruits and sweets arranged in artistic displays. A single royal banquet might feature 20 or 30 different dishes, far more than anyone could actually eat. The excess was intentional. It demonstrated that the kingdom had resources to waste on a single meal. The monarch's table sat elevated on a platform where everyone could observe the royal family dining. This visibility served multiple purposes. It showed that the monarch had nothing to hide and was not afraid of poison, since everyone watched the meat. It allowed guests to observe royal favor by noting who sat nearest the throne and who received the monarch's attention during the meal. And it turned eating into performance, reminding everyone present that the person on that elevated platform was fundamentally different from ordinary people. Even consuming food became a demonstration of royal status. Conversation during banquets followed unwritten rules. Guests could not speak freely about any topic. Political discussions happened cautiously, with careful word choices and constant awareness that others listened. Personal topics were generally avoided unless you knew someone extremely well. Instead, people discussed neutral subjects like hunting, current fashions, or recent festivals. Yet even these seemingly innocent conversations carried meaning. Mentioning that you plan to visit your estate soon would signal you were withdrawing from court politics temporarily. Complimenting someone's clothing could be genuine, or could mock them subtly depending on tone and context. Entertainment accompanied most royal banquets. Musicians performed throughout the meal, playing from galleries overlooking the dining hall. The music had to be loud enough to be heard, but not so loud that conversation became impossible. Choosing the right musicians and the right pieces was politically important. Some guests judged the quality of entertainment as a measure of the host's sophistication and resources. Foreign visitors reported back to their own courts about the quality of music and entertainment, comparing it to what their own kingdoms offered. Between courses, performers might present short theatrical pieces, acrobatic displays, or other entertainments. These interludes gave guests opportunities to move around, speak with people seated at other tables, and form private conversations away from their assigned seats. The movement and noise provided cover for political discussions that might be noticed in quieter settings. Smart courtiers used entertainment breaks to accomplish diplomatic business that would be too obvious during formal meetings. After the meal concluded, dancing often began. Royal balls followed elaborate protocols about who could dance with whom and in what order. The monarch typically opened the dancing with a partner of high rank. Other couples joined according to their status. Dance partnerships were political statements. A king choosing to dance with a particular nobleman's wife honored that family. A queen dancing with a foreign ambassador signaled diplomatic favor. Young unmarried nobles used dances to court potential spouses, though always under careful observation from family members watching to ensure proper behavior. Dancing was also physically demanding exercise that required skill and practice. Courtiers spent significant time learning current dance styles because performing poorly in front of the court meant social embarrassment. The complexity of dances increased over this period, with more elaborate steps and formations that separated skilled dancers from awkward ones. Excelling at dance was a sign of refinement and education that enhanced one's status at court. Evening entertainment sometimes included theatrical performances. Traveling acting companies presented plays, or court members themselves performed in elaborate masks and pageants. These performances often contained political allegories that praised the monarchy, celebrated military victories, or commented on current events through mythological or historical stories. The content was never random. Someone planned what plays would be performed and what messages they conveyed. Smart courtiers watched these performances carefully for clues about political currents and royal opinions. Games provided another evening activity. Card games, dice games, and board games were popular at court. Some monarchs loved gambling and played for significant sums. Others preferred games of strategy that tested mental skill rather than luck. Playing games with the monarch was an honor that provided private access and conversation time that many courtiers desperately wanted. But it also required caution. Winning too obviously might seem like showing up the monarch. Losing too obviously might seem like insulting their intelligence by not trying. Finding the right balance required social skill and careful observation of the monarch's mood and preferences. Private audiences often happened during evening hours. While public business concluded during the day, sensitive matters requiring discretion to be discussed in smaller private rooms with only trusted advisors present. These private meetings were where real decisions sometimes happened, away from the observation of the full court. Nobles who gained access to these private evening audiences wielded disproportionate influence because they could speak to the monarch without dozens of competitors present trying to influence the conversation. The royal household's evening routine continued even as guests departed or retired. The monarch had personal time, though never truly alone. Servants attended to changing clothes from formal dinner attire to evening wear. Close companions might be invited to private chambers for informal conversation, cards, or just relaxing after the day's performance of monarchy. These intimate gatherings were highly valued because they represented genuine personal relationships rather than political theatre. Monarchs carefully guarded this private time and chose companions based on personal preference rather than rank or political necessity. Reading provided evening entertainment for educated monarchs. Many rulers maintained private libraries and spent time reading religious texts, philosophy, history, or letters from correspondents across Europe. This intellectual engagement served practical purposes. Well-read monarchs could discuss ideas with ambassadors and scholars, demonstrating their education and sophistication. Knowledge gained from reading helped inform political decisions and provided historical precedents for current situations. Some monarchs wrote during evening hours, composing letters, poetry, or even books on topics that interested them. Religious observance marked the end of many monarchs' days. Evening prayers or Vesper services provided spiritual reflection and public demonstration of piety. The royal chapel held evening services that the monarch attended, often with a smaller group than the elaborate morning mass. These evening religious observances were generally more personal and less theatrical than morning ceremonies, though still public enough to demonstrate the monarch's devotion and connection to divine authority. The transition to night brought its own security concerns. Darkness provided cover for plots and attacks. Guards increased evening patrols through palace corridors. Doors to royal chambers were locked and heavily guarded. Trusted servants slept in chambers adjacent to the monarch's bedroom, ready to respond if threats emerged during night hours. Despite all precautions, nighttime remained the period of greatest vulnerability. Several monarchs throughout history were attacked or assassinated during evening or night hours when security was harder to maintain and when exhaustion made everyone less alert. Favorites and close advisors sometimes stayed with monarchs late into the evening, discussing matters too sensitive for larger audiences. These late-night conversations shaped policy and politics as much as formal council meetings did. A trusted advisor who had the monarch's ear in private evening hours could influence decisions that hundreds of other courtiers never even knew were being made. This created jealousy and resentment among those excluded from these intimate circles, fueling the political competition that defined court life. Romantic liaisons happened during evening hours, though always with significant risk. Monarchs who took lovers had to arrange meetings discreetly to avoid scandal or political complications. Secret passages, trusted servants, and careful timing allowed some level of privacy, though total secrecy was nearly impossible in an environment where everyone spied on everyone else. Affairs that became known publicly could cause political problems, especially if they offended important nobles or suggested that the monarch was distracted from governing by personal pleasures. The evening hours revealed much about a monarch's true character. During public ceremonies and formal meetings, behavior was scripted and controlled. In the more relaxed evening atmosphere, a monarch's genuine personality emerged more clearly. Were they generous or petty, intellectually curious or bored by serious discussion, kind to servants or cruel when they thought nobody important was watching? Observant courtiers gathered these insights and used them to better predict the monarch's reactions and preferences in political matters. Eventually, night deepened and the palace quieted. Guests departed to their own chambers or homes. Servants completed final tasks before seeking their own rest. The monarch retired to bed, ending another day of performing power. But even sleep did not bring complete respite. Dreams might trouble worried monarchs. Early morning would come quickly, beginning the cycle again. The evening hours provided a brief transition between the public performance of day and the private vulnerability of night, a space where pleasure and politics intermingled, where relaxation never quite erased the constant awareness that being a monarch meant always being watched, always being judged, and always carrying the weight of crown and kingdom, even when the formal crown was removed and locked away until the next day's ceremonies began once more. As midnight approached, the monarch prepared for sleep through another elaborate ceremony that mirrored the morning's awakening ritual. Just as rising from bed was public theatre, so too was retiring to bed. The evening ceremony, called the couture in French courts, involved the same cast of nobles who attended the morning lever, though the atmosphere was different. The day's work was finished, exhaustion replaced morning energy, yet the protocols remained strict and the political significance just as important. Who helped the monarch undress revealed the hierarchy of the court as clearly as any formal meeting or ceremony. The bedchamber filled once again with courtiers waiting in careful order according to rank. The same positions that mattered in the morning mattered now. The first gentleman of the bedchamber supervised the undressing process. Other nobles stood ready to receive each piece of clothing it was removed. The order was reversed from mourning. Crown and jewels came off first, carefully collected and locked away in treasure rooms under heavy guard. The elaborate evening clothes followed, piece by piece, each handed to a designated noble whose sole responsibility was receiving that specific garment. The ritual moved slowly and deliberately. Speed would have been disrespectful and would have diminished the ceremony's importance. Each action had to be performed correctly, in proper sequence, by the right person. Mistakes were noted and discussed. A noble who fumbled while receiving a royal garment might face whispered criticism that damaged their reputation for days or weeks. These were not tasks that anyone could perform carelessly. They were honors that carried responsibility and required perfect execution. As clothing was removed, simpler night clothes replaced the day's finery. A linen nightshirt, plain and comfortable compared to the gold-threaded magnificence worn during the day. A nightcap to keep the head warm, soft slippers instead of jeweled shoes. The transformation was striking. The monarch who had looked almost superhuman in full royal regalia now appeared more ordinary, more human. But the ceremony prevented anyone from forgetting that this person, however simply dressed for sleep, remained the kingdom's ruler with absolute power over everyone present.